Usually when I'm thinking of a one-off story, I'm thinking of like what is the most crucial point in this person's life. Like I'm kind of discarding every other point in their life, though I'm sure that they've have interesting lives for the rest of their time. The point that interests me is like the very most crucial time.
Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Julie Duffy from the Story a Day podcast. My guest today on the podcast is Matthew Salisis, the author of 3 novels, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear, The 100-Year Flood, and I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying. He was adopted from Korea and currently lives in Iowa. And he's also the author of the new book, Craft in the Real World, which we're going to talk about quite a lot in this episode because it's all about how to be a writer in the community of other writers, how to give and receive feedback, and how to think about your own writing with a freedom that you might not have had before. And we'll also talk about his novel in flash fiction, I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying. So welcome, Matthew. I'd like to start with getting you to define what we're talking about when we're talking about craft.
Yeah, so the book is making an argument about craft, that it's a set of expectations that we have from understanding other stories, reading other stories, being told stories as children, kind of growing up in a world of stories, which means that what we think of as what a story should do, or how a story kind of wraps up and goes to an ending, affects how we then expect things to happen in a story. And the expectations that we use as writers are things that we call craft. So our expectations for what the plot might look like, how a character is built, how a story develops themes, or etc., is generally what we call craft in the classroom.
Your book makes the case that a lot of this stuff comes from one source, and the rules are not necessarily the rules for everyone. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I guess by the source we mean something like power, and especially in the culture that we are growing up in, which here, I'm in Iowa in the middle of the country, but I grew up in Connecticut. It's basically the same, right? It's kind of white male supremacy, capitalism, kind of Western imperialist values. And so those things have shaped what we have decided is the canon, which books are supposed to be good books, which books have, lasted, as they say. And those things that we're taught all the way, along every step of the way to be good stories, then go forward as what a good story is. And, the book is saying, yeah, there are actually a lot of different ways to write a good story. It's more about trying to figure out what you're actually doing and what you want to do, and even if it doesn't kind of fit into that one main dominant norm.
So can you tell me, why is that a problem? What have you encountered in workshops and things that show you that this is problematic?
Yeah, so in workshops specifically, it usually means that anybody trying to write something different from that norm then has the worst workshop experience, because everybody is trying to collectively imagine what a story will look like. And so it ends up being that we as a class, or the workshop as a class, reads a story as if it should fit into that one dominant narrative, even if the writer themselves is trying to write for, say, a different audience. I'm Asian American and I'm writing Asian American literature, and Asian American literature has a certain kind of context and history and tradition, which means, right, stories present multiple different ways of thinking about the world and living in the world as Asian American, and trying to, deal with these kind of two cultural poles, but also, just the ways in which identity is so split in between how other people see you versus how you're trying to see yourself outside of those ways. So when I'm writing fiction, I'm thinking a lot about the conversation that I'm entering, right? To kind of write within the dominant mainstream white male norm would be to ignore, right, the conversation that I'm a part of, and would be really to like not be able to talk to the audience that I want to talk to, which is kind of other Asian Americans, and especially those who are interested in what makes a story an Asian American story. Yeah, I think if we don't think consciously about things, then we end up defaulting, right? And the default is the norm, which means, if we're not thinking about who our audience is, it means we're basically writing to the kind of white male mainstream history of what literary fiction is supposed to be. And that's fine if we want to do that, I think. It's just, I'm trying to teach my students to make conscious decisions and to really like do what they want to do. So it requires kind of thinking carefully about who you actually do want to write for and what that means in terms of like what a plot could be, or how a character moves the world, how much the world kind of affects action versus character having agency or something.
There's a lot of discussion about, including characters, more diverse casts in our writing and things like that. That's certainly one way for people to go. And I think a lot of white writers are nervous about that. And you talk about that in the book a bit, the difference between writing a character of color who just sort of has that skin color or that race identification and actually writing that kind of character. So can you give us some clues on what the difference between those two things are?
Yeah, in the book I talk about like what do you notice as a person, right? When I'm walking around the world, I'm noticing things and dangers to me that have to do with how people see me or might treat me. I'm thinking about like how I have to act if I'm supposed to like gain respect from a person versus whether I don't care. Like if I gain respect from a person, how I'm supposed to speak in certain situations. And we're all thinking about this all the time. It's why we speak in one way in the classroom versus another way with our kids versus another way with our friends or parents, right? It's just that those ways are different for different people. Whether it's just kind of gender based or race based or ability based or, sexuality, etc. It always means that we're noticing different things and trying to adjust in different ways to the situation around us. And so that if characters kind of, notice the exact same things, seem to walk through the room as if they're the same, just are different skin colors or are different sexualities, then it's not really writing that character in a way that is thinking about the audience that's going to read that character. Unless you're just trying to write other people for the sake of the dominant norm audience. I actually don't think many people are trying to do that, right? They're trying to include more diversity because they know that they want their readers to be able to read from their different perspectives and find themselves represented in the books in various ways.
Yeah, I love that idea of noticing. What you notice is shaped by who you are. I think that's really powerful. So you talk a lot at the beginning of the book about this workshop situation where, people are asking, we're reviewing each other's work. And a lot of writers, we want feedback. So we go into these critique groups and workshops and we put ourselves in this situation and we ask people, what do you think? And then the sort of MFA approach is for people to sit quietly and be told by the group what the group thinks, which trips over all these things you've just been talking about. And you do have a better model or several better models. So before we freak everyone out and tell them that they can't give anyone feedback because they're doing it wrong, can you give us some ways that it can go wrong and then some better ways to approach giving people feedback?
I guess there are some things that I do think are better. The basic idea is just that we can approach these things differently for different people rather than trying to use like a one size fits all model. Some people might do well under a situation where they are silent in the workshop, though I actually feel like that's probably very few people. Most people need to talk just so that they can explain things that are going on and what they're trying to do with the stories. And I think actually, like you're saying, That's a kind of strange and arbitrary MFA thing that doesn't actually happen that much in just groups of writer friends who get together and talk about each other's work. Usually we feel more by being silent since we don't get to hear about the author's process at all. We're supposed to kind of know from the page, which only really helps us to understand like whether they were successful in the thing that we expect them to do rather than whether they were successful in the thing that they are trying to do, especially for writers who are persuaded easily by people who are carefully reading their work, which is a lot of people. It's easy to fall into the trap of listening and following directions that aren't really helping you to do what you want to do. It's helpful, I think, in a workshop situation and any kind of feedback situation to get as much. And then when I'm thinking about different models for workshop, there's a bunch of models in the book that I kind of use to specifically help as I can, as much as I can, the individual author and individual stories, especially with thinking about revision processes that they might work with. So like if I have like a fragmented story where the structure is malleable and the student is trying to figure out where to put different pieces, we might like cut the story up into those fragments and put it on the wall and move them around to try to figure out, like with the student's help, how these pieces moving around would change what the story looks like. There's a bunch of different models in the book that I think can be used to apply to individual situations rather than kind of, trying to blanket the entire group of writers.
I want to talk about the last section of your book as well, which is these wonderful writing exercises. Can you tell us about your approach to those writing exercises and like what you're trying to do with them?
Yeah, thank you for asking about them. The exercises come from my own classes. So they've actually been things that I've worked probably the most on. With the book, as I try to talk about these things with my students, some still choose to kind of like write a Star Wars-y hero's journey with like a kind of in a very typical form. It's just that they're making that choice like consciously, right? And they know what they're getting into and they know the kind of implications of their choices. And I think all of that is good for us. I think the more we can kind of think about what we're doing in life and also in writing is probably a good thing. With the exercises, one of my kind of pet peeves as a student was not really knowing what to do or not getting any advice about like what to do concretely with a story, rather kind of talking about abstractly what might happen. Sometimes famous authors would come in and they would, and some would be great and they would tell us exactly what they were doing when they were trying to do things. And some would say, you just kind of feel it out, when a story is working because you feel it in your soul or whatever. That's like almost an exact quote. And that, that's never seemed very helpful to me. And so as I was teaching, I was really trying to help students to get the tools that they would be able to use after I wasn't there to help them, right? That once they left the class and nobody was kind of telling them, now try this, or now try this, or now ask this of your work, and now ask this of your work, how could they do it on their own? And so exercises were a way to try to get them to do that work, outside of the classroom. And a lot of it was revision based. So a lot of the exercises are, actually almost all of the exercises, it's kind of split into two sections. One is the exercises that I like literally use in the classroom based around talking about arc or plot or characterization or so forth to help the students like practice a single element. So for characterization, there's this exercise that's like start a bunch of sentences that with the phrase, they were the kind of person who blah, blah, blah. And then students are trying to figure out then like what makes somebody a kind of person and what makes them different from all the other people in their story. With tone, I'm asking them to kind of modulate tone around like, say you have a very pessimistic character, but you want the story to be optimistic. How do you do that? So they're trying to do that or do the reverse. And those things are just kind of practice with these various elements. And then the other section is, I'm not remembering the exact number, 34. I'm looking at it now. 34 revision exercises, which I I think I give them a list of like 50 something, but I tried to cut it down to the most helpful ones for the book. And they're real exercises that I've given my classes, just thinking about what they want to do next. So at the end of my workshops, I ask students to say, you know, if they were going to go home and immediately start working on their stories, which I'm hoping that they have the energy and enthusiasm at the end of the workshop to want to do that. That's our goal. And then I'm giving a bunch of revision exercises to the class based on what the author has said that they want to do with their own story. And so I'm like kind of adapting the next step that they say they'll take to kind of more general applicability, so that anybody in the class can use the exercise on their own work. And I'm always giving them options. So like one of the options is based on what the author has said, and then there's a couple more options in case that doesn't seem to kind of jive with what they're thinking about doing individually. And so these revision exercises come directly out of what students have told me they wanted to do with their stories. The first few are ways of kind of looking at the story or re-looking at the story, and then the others are really things to do on the page practically, both of those things, I think, in order to help kind of think of new opportunities for the story.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about your novel in flash fiction, which let me get this right way around. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. Is that the right way around?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, I'm just saying.
I invented that phrase.
Okay, good. You can just trademark that. So this is a novel that you told in flash fiction stories. And if I'm right, you did this either after writing a longer novel or sort of during the revision phase of a longer novel?
The 100-Year Flood, which ended up being my second novel, was my first novel, kind of in the process of writing it. And it took me 11 years to write. So there was a long time in there where I felt at various times very enthusiastic about it and very, very unenthusiastic about it. I often, with any revision process, right, you're kind of like bouncing between all of these different feelings. And during a period of time when I felt like I just wanted to finish something, I decided I would write like a story or two a day, very short stories. And I gave myself the prompt of just choosing an object and then writing a story about it. So all of the chapters in I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying came from sometimes me like looking around my office and choosing something, but sometimes thinking about other objects. The first chapter starts with starfish. And so I had written actually just a few of these, like maybe 40 of them or so. And somebody had asked me for a book, and I said, oh, well, how long do you want the book to be? Like, what's the minimum length requirement for this? And I think they said like 120 or something, 140. And I was like, because I have like 40 of these one-page stories. And so I thought, okay, I'll just write a lot more of them. So I kept writing them. I must have written maybe 150 or 160. And then when I was putting the book together, so it covers kind of a year in this person's life. At the beginning of the year, he finds out that he has a son that he had not known about, who's like 5 years old. And the end of the year, it's an end of a year, I guess. That's self-explanatory. But within that year, he's kind of trying to figure out how to be a father and how to like turn his life, which is really chaotic and it's a total mess, really. And he's just trying to figure out, now that he knows that he's a father, how he can be the kind of person who could at all provide some kind of life model for this child, or to at least kind of try to help parent this child or to parent this child. And so I'd written all these kind of individual parts of this person's life, and I put the pages, because they're all one page or shorter. I put the literal pages all around the floor of my house. I took up like 2 rooms, but at that time we had like a living dining room thing, so I was able to do it. And my oldest child was maybe like 1 or something. She was still crawling. And so I had to like ask my wife to keep her in a different room so that I could do this. And I was like literally walking through the book, trying to figure out where everything could go and moving like the physical pieces of paper around. And in the process of doing that, I cut out, I think like 40 or 45 pieces. And so it's now like 115, I think, chapters, 1-page chapters. Though in the book form, I think 1 or 2 of the chapters go onto a second page because of the size of the pages or font or something. And so I was just trying to, at that time, that felt like very productive to me because of the slog of writing a novel over a long period of time. And I just needed a way where I could feel productive because I felt so unproductive with the novel. I was like producing a lot of work and doing a lot of revision, but none of it was in any kind of finished form.
What is the difference between just writing a short chapter and writing a series of flash fiction?
Yeah, so those are, I guess for me, that's kind of related. Every chapter I thought of as a standalone story in that it had to kind of have a beginning, middle, and end of its own. And many of them were kind of published as one or like a group of 3 stories. And so I wanted them all to be stories and not kind of, I think with the other novels that I've written, they all feel very unexcertable to me. And so when people have been asking for excerpts, I never know what to give them because I'm thinking of it all the time as just one very long story, and none of the parts kind of can come out and be just like a full beginning, middle, and end on their own. But for that book, I was thinking of every single chapter as a story. The difference between writing kind of like a one-off standalone story and the chapters for that was usually when I'm thinking of a one-off story, I'm thinking of like what is the most crucial point in this person's life. And so, like I'm kind of discarding every other point in their life, though I'm sure that they have interesting lives for the rest of their time. The point that interests me is like the very most crucial time. But for the chapters, I started with that same thing, which is why the first chapter is kind of like the sun showing up. But as I was thinking about like this whole period of time as a very crucial period of time in this character's life, then I was thinking about like, well, what are specific points along the way that would help change the character from where he starts to like where he is trying at least to go by the end of a year. And so they were all kind of like crucial points within that larger crucial period. But usually when I'm writing like a standalone flash or any standalone story, I'm thinking like just what is the one crucial thing.
Say thank you, Matthew Salasas, for
thank
both
you so
the
much.
craft in the real world and the fiction writing and the teaching that you're doing.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful.
If you want to learn to write, don't read another book or article. Start writing. I'm here to invite you to consider the Story a Day 3-day challenge. It's a challenge and a workshop that gets people writing and completing stories in just 3 days. And it works. I'm fanatical about getting more and more diverse stories into the world, and I think yours should be among them. If you're feeling the pull to write or level up your storytelling, let me hold your hand through 3 days of short story writing. Check out the 3-day challenge at storyaday.org/3DC. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week and of course, keep writing.